Welcome to the Remarkable Retail Podcast, Season 10, Episode number 10. I'm Michael LeBlanc.
And I'm Steve Dennis.
Our very special guest back on the show today with the first of a two-part interview is the one and only, you know him, you love him, Jason Retail Geek Goldberg, Chief Commerce Strategy Officer at Publicis. Steve, there's a small core set of retail observers and analysts that both of us look to for insight and inspiration. Jason is certainly one of them. Such a great conversation. Just not enough time.
Yeah, well, we were lucky enough to get him for a bit more than our original plan, which is good, which led to the two parts. But yeah, he has such great perspective. He's just got amazing experience. And because of what he does today at Publicis, he's out there gathering data, trying to make sense of it and explaining it to people. And I think he does it with great humor and with great insight. And, part of what we get to do here is dig into some of the data he's looking at, but more so, I think, his perspectives on the growing concentration in retail, the acceleration of digital e-commerce, as well as a word that we have said on occasion on the podcast, and we might say it more than once, bifurcation.
Once or 10 times in the episode, and an angel gets its wings every time it happens. So we're very happy to come back to that. Now, you and I, just a reminder to all the folks, you and I will be in Vegas Shop Talk. You'll be on the stage on Wednesday with your session, Pivots, Making Bold Changes with Agility and Flexibility. See registration if you haven't at this point. Maybe it's a last minute thing for you. You'll find that in the show notes. All right, let's get right to the news. And as always, there's plenty of it. It's brought to you by our friends at Celonis, enabling process intelligence to make business processes work across systems, departments, and organizations. Try it for free at celonis.com. That's CELONIS.com. All right, so it's another week of tariff craziness. We don't want to, lots of people are seeing all the details about, tariffs that are coming and going. So we don't really need to get into all the details of that. But hit the highlights for us, particularly in the context of retail and against the backdrop of all the other things happening. Just tie a bow on it and just give people some context before we jump into the rest of the news.
Well, a couple of things. And as you say, there's so much coverage on this that I imagine if anybody's really interested in it, they've got many news sources and many rabbit holes they could go down. I think this past week, one thing is the uncertainty isn't going away. If anything, you could argue it's going up because tariffs are on, tariffs are off. The president has a hissy fit, and now there's a 200% tariff on champagne, going after more global players. So some of the things that happened this past week is that more players, not only France, for example, being drawn into getting some tariffs on wines and liquors, but other players in other countries that sell steel and aluminum and these kinds of things. So on and again, off again, who knows where it will be when people listen to this. So that's why we perhaps shouldn't spend too much time on it. One thing that did emerge last week, which I think many people might have heard of, which is Trump has really locked down on this April 2nd date again with the toing and froing, whether that will really stick. But at that point, he basically said, we're going to work out all the reciprocal tariffs by April 2nd. So that's just a couple weeks away. What that really ultimately looks like, what things will get negotiated, what exceptions might happen, what other things might get added. If a prime minister or premier insults him a little bit, maybe they get whacked with 500% tariffs on donuts. I don't know. Who knows? The one thing I would say, which is kind of concerning, I shouldn't say kind of concerning, very concerning, is just before we got on the mic here, we got some information on U.S. consumer confidence. And U.S. consumer confidence dropped a lot. The most it has, to a point. Actually, interestingly, consumer confidence reached a several-year high in November, but now it has dropped so much that it is as low as it was a couple, 2-3 years ago. So not the lowest it's been in a long, long time, but considerably lower than it's been in the last few years. But really, it's the rate of change. And all of this really ladders back, I think, to the stuff we've just been talking about.
Quick question for you, from your perspective on the average American citizen. Trade policy and all these things are, are pretty eclectic. Is this confidence being dropped by all the Doge stuff that's really laying people off? Or is it this tariffs that might increase their prices? Or is it the price of eggs? Like, it feels to me like it's a mix of all three, but more so all the kind of craziness that's happening with the federal government. What's your perspective?
The research I've seen, and at least speaking from the U.S. perspective, is it's very hard to turn on the news and not hear stories about inflationary concerns. A lot of news this past week about many of the investment banks and other economists raising the possibility of or the statistical chances of a recession. Lots of stories about layoffs. And then, you presumably have some number of people that have already experienced layoffs, whether it's themselves, whether it's a relative or friend, whether there's, I know firsthand of several people who work at companies where they just recently put in a hiring freeze, like in the last 2 weeks. So I think, multiple people are getting multiple data points that says, this is bad or could be bad and could get worse.
Can I pick up on that theme for a sec? Because I wanted to touch on your lessons from Leaders Leap on how to lead through a period such as this. I mean, It's interesting that we're almost 5 years to the month from the declaration of a global health crisis where leadership and leading was tested. My sense is leaders came out more, 5 years later, they're more resilient. They're a little less likely to jump at shadows. So we learned some positive lessons. But, as you sit back and kind of watch this turmoil, what's your advice to the folks listening about leading in a period of such uncertainty? I mean, right down to the store level. It's I talk to retailers every day. They say they're worried about the mental health of the people in the store. Like, it's a lot, right? It's a lot to process, just like COVID.
Well, that's probably a whole podcast by itself. I mean, I do think maybe two comments on this. One is just generally, I think that you have to fundamentally, I think one of the lines I have in the book is, agility is the new black. Like, in a world that's changing very quickly and a lot's coming at you, you just have to be willing to both experiment and try more stuff, but you have to build agility into the system. And I definitely think that was a main takeaway from, the kind of fixed supply chains or certain ways of doing things that got broken largely by COVID. And I think folks have learned from that. And this is just another example of, you may not have been sitting here 6 months ago. And I think most people 6 months ago would not have said we would find ourselves in this particular situation. So just don't think you have control over your destiny, or that just with good analysis you can figure everything out and be ready for almost anything. I think that's a fallacy. The second thing, and I've gotten some comments on this, and I'll make this brief, maybe we'll come back to it, is some people have said to me, well, it sounds like I'm pretty negative on Trump, but isn't Trump doing some of the things that I recommend in the book, which is to be bolder. And I think it's very fair to say, and this is not just an issue for the U.S. government, I imagine this is true for a lot of our listeners in whatever country they're in, is that government often doesn't work all that well, just in general. Many governments are faced with budget deficits and seemingly insurmountable problems. And typically not, even though these problems have been around, like in the United States, the federal budget deficits have been problems for a long time. How to fund the Social Security program. And like a lot of these things are decades-long issues, and you can see a crisis on the horizon. Now, some people disagree about how big a crisis it's going to be and how fast it's going to happen, but I think almost everybody would agree it's a problem, and we've done very little to address it. So I think you can make the argument that incremental change, sucking less, as I often talk about it, is not going to address this. So I think that's a very valid comment. I do think the U.S. and many governments need more aggressive, bolder action. I think there is a level of denial about the realities and the problems that are right here or down the road. The issue with Trump is, well, there's many issues with Trump. But first of all, governments aren't the same as corporations. So the aim of corporations is to drive shareholder value versus governments to serve, the broader good and try to, level the playing field. There's a bunch of things that governments fundamentally are aiming to do, which call for different types of leadership. Not that business concepts can't be brought to it. So I think that's an important thing. But But, what you have to do as a leader is, when I talk about being bold in the book, I try to make a very, very clear point that there's a difference between being bold and being reckless and taking on too much risk and not bringing people along with you. And Trump, in terms of the scale of recklessness scale, is at a 10. Part of what I talk about in the book is you have to really have very good insight and mindfulness. Trump is a disaster in that regard. So yeah, boldness, sure. He's moving fast and breaking things, but I think the goal is not to move fast and break things. It's to move fast and fix things, make the world better. And so, yes, change is needed, bold change is needed, but you need to get the right balance. And if you can't bring people along with you, or you drive yourself into the ditch in the meantime, that is demonstrably a terrible transformation strategy.
Let's move along right into the retail news. Actually, let's talk about retailers. Let's talk about Kohl's. Boy, they put out some numbers that just weren't good.
Yeah, well, it was another big week of earnings. And like I said last week, we could go through 15, 16, 17 big retailer earnings. We won't try to hit on the highlights, but I guess surprising no one, Kohl's had another disastrous quarter. Their comps decreased almost 7%. They barely broke even on a profitability basis. And they gave, as really I think just about every retailer, except maybe Dollar General, gave a weak outlook. So they're in good company there, I guess. One of the things about Kohl's, which is quite remarkable in the bad way, is their sales have been down for 12 straight quarters. If you look, and I didn't do the actual math, I've done it in the past, but if you look at how much revenue they've lost and how many customers they've lost since the pre-COVID times, it's quite extraordinary. And as you'll hear in our interview with Jason, the retail industry has actually done really well post-COVID. So they have not come remotely close to keeping pace. Now, they are caught up in being stuck in the middle a bit, not being as strong a value player. Apparel spending, we saw some results from Citi research that said that apparel spending is down 12% year over year. So to the extent apparel is a big part of Kohl's business, they're fighting some headwinds there. I did want to mention a couple quick things. One is Ashley Buchanan is the new CEO, former CEO of Michaels. He's only been there a couple months, so I don't think we're really seeing much. He did talk a little bit about, at least in the near term, he said that he still needs more time to really work on the long-term strategy, but they were going to focus, have more curation. Nobody's ever said that before, with an emphasis on private label. Now, 2 CEOs ago, the emphasis was on private label. Then they went on emphasis on national brands. Now they're going back to private label. So we'll see. Reestablish Kohl as a leader in quality and value. Interesting. I'm not sure that's really a strategy, but, and then here, wait for this, create a frictionless shopping experience. Yeah, so 2005 called and wants its press release back. So he, to his credit, he did not say unified or phygital. So I give him points for that. But yeah, it's hard to look at that and see that as a groundbreaking, share-gaining strategy. It sounds like this is pretty much what everybody does. But anyway, well, the last thing I was going to add, so I mean, obviously more to come there, and their outlook, they're doing this in the face of some definite overall market challenges. So they're not going to have an easy time. A couple of other things I wanted to mention. One is they now are apparently not taking Amazon returns at many of their stores. This was pieced together by some research a reporter did. So there has been no official announcement. So we don't really know what percent of stores aren't taking Amazon returns anymore, but the several that she checked in different parts of the country, the answer was they weren't. So that seems like a big change, particularly since when Michelle Gass was running it, they were talking about how great that was and how it was really improving traffic. Well, apparently it now turns out that it's not driving traffic and incremental sales. So they are backing up on that. But last thing I'll say just quickly is a couple of weeks ago, I did go out and visited 3 Kohl's stores in the Dallas area. And my overall impression was they were really a train wreck. A tremendous amount of clearance merchandise. I was actually surprised to see that their gross margin improved a little bit. Maybe they're going to take the hit in, in February and March. So we'll see that in the next quarter. But I was just amazed by how much clearance merchandise was there, and most of it was 70 to 90% off. So they clearly are having a hard time, at least in Dallas, with the sell-through. So it'll be interesting to see next quarter how that sorts out. But the stores also were just a mess, some of it because of so much clearance merchandise. But so they got a lot of work to do on an executional level as well as a strategic level. So we shall see. And then Ulta, one of our favorite retailers, they actually had an okay quarter, but we're seeing with Ulta, just as we've seen with Sephora, with ELF Cosmetics, a lot of the beauty players talking about a slowdown. Now, beauty was a category that was really strong in the 2 or 3 years after COVID, which seems a little bit funny because, if you're at home, why do you need that much makeup? But maybe that's a little... I know when I was, when we would record a podcast, I wanted to feel pretty. So, but anyway, their comps were up just 1.5%. Their profits were quite solid. So they're managing the business well, and they're not slowing down in terms of their growth. They opened 66 stores last year, and they're now up to almost 1,500 locations. So that's quite a large footprint just in the United States. So it's, I don't know if they ever quote, what percent of the population lives within a 10-minute drive of an Ulta, but I would think it's significantly north of 90% at this point.
Yeah, no kidding.
And then another retailer that we definitely admire that's been doing well, though slowing down a little bit, is Dick's Sporting Goods. But they came in with a really strong fourth quarter, 6.4% comp, net income up 11%, but as everybody is doing, it's flat-ish is the new up. They're predicting that their sales growth will slow substantially, so they're looking more in the 1% to 3% range. So, it's again, I think it's really a picture of pretty decent holiday quarter, but everybody really tapping the brakes when it comes to the immediate future.
Well, talking about all these big brands, let's talk about some wobbly unicorn brands. Let's take a visit. We haven't been here in a while. The Wobbly Unicorn Corner.
Let's we also got a couple of the high-profile disruptor unicorn types, or in this case, former unicorns. So both these brands we're going to talk about had billion-dollar plus valuations at one point. In fact, I think Allbirds, first one I'll talk about, was at 3 or 4 billion, or shortly after their IPO. Well, so they had another terrible quarter. They've been trying to go to, so originally, without getting into too much detail, originally they were really direct-to-consumer only, e-commerce and their own stores. They'd grown up to, I think, close to 60 stores. Business was terrible. They've started to bail on their own stores. They've closed, I think, close to half of them at this point, and they have been switching to wholesale. Now, there was a story that this switch to wholesale was what was causing their problems. Unfortunately, the facts don't line up with that. Their performance has been terrible for multiple years before they start the switch to wholesale. Now, the switch to wholesale was a hope to try to right the ship. So far, not going too well, but they're in the middle of doing it. But, we talked to Carrie Baker last week, great direct-to-consumer mix of direct-to-consumer wholesale brand. Listeners of that interview might remember that she talked about Canada Goose, or we talked about Canada Goose having 74% gross margin. Well, Allbirds is about half of that. So really, I think speaks both to probably how they're managing the brand, but really their ability to command a premium price. So the problems at Allbirds are much more fundamental. The stock has lost 99, I think it's actually like 98.89 when I checked this morning, of its market value since its IPO. They still are cash negative. They are forecasting declining revenue and challenges for the immediate future. So I think this is a company that either will file for bankruptcy or will get acquired, because a bigger conglomerate could probably pick them up for $30 or $40 million. It's like a rounding error for a VF for somebody like that. But are they capturing the proverbial falling knife?
Yeah. I mean, you and I have been saying this for, I don't know, years, literally. Yeah. My only surprise, they're still around. Whether it's 40 million or 50 million or 60 million, or whether they just liquidate. Like there's doesn't seem to be a lot of hope, but they keep going. They keep jogging along. Let's talk about, let's change gears a little bit, talk about another wobbly unicorn, Stitch Fix, which I had the early days AI tailwind behind it. We're going to figure this out with the power of AI and merchandising. But
AI stylists. I wouldn't say they can declare victory here, but 18 months, or we're about 18 months into Matt Baer's tenure as the new CEO. Matt came over, had a bunch of experience, but came over, who's, I believe, the chief digital officer at Macy's. And what he's been doing, I think conceptually sounds great, which is really trying to do, what I talk about in Leaders Leap, which is, get that better aim on who really is your obsessive core customer and try to bring more value to a somewhat smaller group rather than casting too wide a net. The statistics show that strategy is gaining traction. It is decreasing their top line, but some of their core customer metrics are better. They have stabilized a lot of the negative metrics. So they're in a position where they are not predicting robust growth, but they are predicting improving profitability. So unlike Allbirds, while Stitch Fix has lost a lot of its value since going public, it is worth, I think, I want to say around 500 or 600 million comparing to Stitch Fix, which, Allbirds was worth like 25 million. The stock has been up over the last period. So Wall Street is seeing signs of encouragement. So again, I wouldn't declare victory here or say this is, a truly remarkable brand, but a lot of what they're doing seems to be moving things in the right direction. And, perhaps they'll be in a position in 6 months' time, 12 months' time to actually start to really drive that top line growth profitably.
All right. Well, that's it for the news. Let's leave it there. Thanks again to our friends at Celonis for being our presenting sponsor for the news. And now let's get to part one of our two-part episode with Jason, a retail geek, Goldberg, and we'll come back with a few comments on what he has to say right after listening to him and getting him on the mic.
Well, Jason, retail geek Goldberg, welcome back to the Remarkable Retail Podcast after something like 4.5 years. How are you today?
I am excellent. My family tells me that that's the exact right interval for me to remain interesting.
That feels right to me. But we've tried a few times to get you back on, but you are so busy that it's often difficult. Which brings me to my kickoff question, which is for people that might possibly not know who the heck you are, which seems very, very unlikely. But nevertheless, could you tell our audience a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Sure. So as mentioned, I'm Jason Goldberg. My day job is I'm the Chief Commerce Strategy Officer for the Publicis Group. And many of my friends quickly point out that I'm not paid by the word in my title, so don't get too excited about that. Publicis Group is, of course, a big, giant marketing and advertising holding company with a bunch of agencies, and I get to work across all of the agency's clients that are focused on retail or commerce outcomes. So that's pretty fun. I'm a fourth generation retailer. Got to work with a bunch of big retailers on their digital transformations back in the dark ages before they knew how to hire competent people. I'm somewhat well known for a podcast I started way back before podcasting was cool 11 years ago now.
Wow. And how many episodes do you have on the podcast?
A bit of a sore subject. I do. I think we're at 368. And we were quite consistent weekly for probably 8 of those years. And then my annoyingly successful co-host, has been more bandwidth constrained lately. So we're a little sporadic at the moment. Our pace of publishing has slowed down, which the smart people are really happy for, but some people bust my chops for that.
Well, we might catch up to you at some point because I think we're at about 250. So watch your back, buddy.
Yeah. But I feel like you're much more consistent these days. So I enjoy listening to you guys.
Yeah, but I need to get myself a remarkably successful co-host. So if you got any ideas for that,
you would be
no. It's like I've tested it thoroughly, and it's not fun being the least popular guest on a podcast or host.
All right. Well, enough of this frivolity. Let's move on. Michael, would you like to?
Listen, we got a ton to talk about, so we're thrilled to have you for 3 or 4 hours this afternoon to go through it all. Let's start with just a broad question at a high level. When you're taking calls or whatever you do with your clients these days, what are the couple of 2, 3, even longer or shorter things that are just number one top priorities they're most interested in figuring out right now?
Yeah, well, 3. And before I jump into them, I just want to say, Michael, on behalf of all Americans, I apologize.
Thank you. Elbows up, as Cordial would say.
Yeah, I'm sure it's going to work out great for everyone. Part of the fun part of my job, one of the things I really enjoy is we have a huge diversity of clients with an incredible diversity of challenges and opportunities. So I do... I'll tell you the 3 that come up most often, but I do want to caveat by saying there's a quite long tail of topics that I get to try to explore and work on, which I appreciate. That being said, the 3 that come up most often, in no particular order, we have a lot of conversations around retail media networks, which I mostly hate and I'm somewhat bearish on. But I work for a giant advertising agency, and so anything with the word media in it gets them super excited.
Sure.
And I have some clients that operate very successful retail media network businesses, and that has spawned every other retailer on the planet deciding that that's an important initiative for them to undertake. Sometimes I think to their own detriment. But so that's one. Number 2 at the moment is there are these initials. I think they're both in the word bifurcation, if I'm not mistaken, but they're, what is it? AI.
Ah, yes.
And so you can't spell bifurcation without AI, Stephen. But that being said, AI is a super interesting one. My kind of top line POV, it's very likely to have a prominent impact and be one of the most substantive changes in commerce in all of our lifetime, and it's simultaneously overhyped. So
what inning are we in, Jason? If we're
always, the answer to that question is always the first inning, Michael. Okay. We all have an inappropriately short time horizon. We're still in the first inning of digital, much less AI. So that one comes up a lot of interesting conversations. And then the most regrettable one these days is the word, if you're curious what Webster's word of 2025 is going to be, it's going to be uncertainty. And so obviously, like, I have a lot of big clients that are tied closely to the North American economies in particular. And there's an incredible amount of chaos, turmoil, and uncertainty at the moment that, is going to create some headwinds, but also some opportunities for a lot of retailers.
Well, we may have uttered some of those words in a few episodes so far this season, but I think a couple of those we might like to come back on. But I wanted to talk because I really love, and I think you've been doing this for a while, when you present you present some of the data, but also give your interpretation on some things like overall sales growth and e-com versus physical store growth. And I think we'll put a link to the nice little video you had on LinkedIn a couple of weeks ago where you went through some of this stuff. But I'm wondering if you might just touch on some of those statistics, what some of those implications are that you find to be most interesting and maybe folks listening might want to take some action upon.
Sure. Yeah. So I think the stats you're probably referring to is I try to deep dive into the U.S. Department of Commerce census data that comes out every month. I know you and I are both disciples of it. It's a wildly imperfect data set. Just so you know, like, the U.S. government mandates that all businesses in the United States reply to this survey every month. In most industries, one of which is retail. And so tens of thousands of retailers fill out these monthly surveys. And the U.S. Department of Commerce aggregates data in those surveys, and they publish monthly data that says how much did we sell at retail and how much did we sell in department stores versus general merchants and a whole bunch of interesting things. And to some extent, how much did we sell in e-commerce? So I try to stay abreast of those statistics. Surveys are wildly imperfect. Like, we don't know how accurate everyone fills them out, and it uses a kind of antiquated taxonomy that I certainly take issue with, but they've been doing it the same way for 40 years. And so it gives us this awesome historical record, and we can compare this month's sales to this month last year and learn a lot from that. So we won't get into the monthly for purposes of this podcast, but annually, 2024 was a very average year in retail. We grew, I want to say 3.6% from memory, which 3.6 is, if you take the 2 COVID years out, 3.6 is the average growth we've had for the last 10 years. The 3 COVID years were the greatest 3 years in the history of retail. In the United States, we mailed $6 trillion to every man, woman, and child, and we didn't let them spend any of that on Taylor Swift tickets. So retail had this huge spike, but we're kind of back to the historical mean at 3.6%. But it's dangerous to look at these averages because, of course, no retailer is experiencing that average year. 5 retailers represent about 58% of all the growth in the United States. So it's mostly Walmart and Amazon, the 2 largest retailers in the U.S. are both growing way faster than the industry average. So Walmart's growing at over 5%, Amazon's growing at over 11%. Costco is an annoyingly successful retailer. I say annoying because they're my nemesis. They're the retailer that takes the least of my advice and performs the best. So there's something to be learned from that, I think. But they are also outgrowing the average. And then these 3 Chinese direct-to-consumer companies are the fastest growing retailer in the history of mankind each of the last 3 years is Temu, Shein, and TikTok shops. So that handful of retailers, 58% of all growth. So the whole rest of retail in the United States, grew at less than 1% if we take them out.
Yeah, and I would imagine I was actually thinking of trying to do this at some point, but I lost focus as I often do. But my guess is if you added in the off-price guys like TJ Maxx, they would be a pretty good contributor to that concentration kind of story as well. Have you ever looked at that in particular? I
have, and I can't share the data off the top of my head. And it would have been super smart for me to open the data right before the podcast, huh? But there are other retailers that are definitely outperforming the industry. I have this joke like, averages are dangerous. On average, Nepal is flat because there's just as many feet up as there are feet down. So certainly, like in general, the deep discounters have done well, like in times of economic headwinds and economic uncertainty. Depending on how you categorize discounters, you also have some underperforming retailers in the discount category, right?
Sure.
So you could look at a JCPenney or a Kohl's and say that model's not going particularly well right now.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So the other thing I think that you talk about often related to this data is the growth of e-commerce versus physical stores. And one of the things that I think you've done a good job of kind of straightening me out on a few times is, on the one hand, there was this idea, and well, not the idea, it did happen that there was a huge acceleration of e-commerce penetration during the main parts of COVID. And that was, both a function of the numerator going up and the denominator going down, but that we've kind of reverted back to what we might have predicted the penetration of e-commerce would be. But still, that actually results, if I understand the numbers that you presented, in a doubling of online sales in 5 years. So you kind of have this, the growth rate has slowed down. And yes, we didn't get this massive acceleration, but still, just on an absolute basis, e-commerce is much, much bigger than it was. Did I kind of characterize that right? And then I guess if I get close, what do you see as the implication of that?
So I think I blame our friends at McKinsey for this, but like early in COVID, they published a lovely point of view piece that said, we just had 10 years of digital acceleration in 3 months. And it turns out when you close all the stores and tell people they might die if they go grocery shopping, they tend to shop online more. Which I don't think is a hypothesis we necessarily needed to test in the real world, but we did. So for sure we had this anomalous spike during COVID, and there were some interesting ebbs and flows because there was actually, like, after the first year of COVID, like we saw some e-commerce fatigue, and we saw retail spike to a level that we weren't historically familiar with, partly because of that fatigue of not going to the stores and the emergence of vaccines, and then all that economic stimulus I referred to, and we still weren't letting people travel. So there were these kind of ups and downs. But when it all played out, it certainly seems true that McKinsey was wrong. Like e-commerce did.
To be fair, that's probably the second worst thing they've been wrong about at most.
Oh, yeah. I'm not even going to put that list together. For a deep cut for your listeners is go read a book called Dangerous Company if you want the deep dive on the dubious track record of all the management consulting firms in the U.S. But sorry to all my McKinsey alumni friends.
I was going to say, there goes our chance to get them to sponsor the podcast, but oh well.
Yeah, they still will. So we did have this big spike, kind of put things in reference. Before COVID, here's what I would have said. Retail grows about 3 to 4% a year. I mentioned 3.6, I think, is the official number. And e-commerce was growing about 15%. That e-commerce number was tricky to talk about because, of course, like early on, it was growing much faster than 15%. And as the number got bigger and bigger, the rate of growth was slowing down, but it still, was 4 to 5 times the rate of growth of brick and mortar retail. And remember, when we talk about retail includes e-commerce. So you almost never see, we sometimes publish it, but you almost never see brick and mortar sales versus e-commerce. What you almost always see is total retail sales versus e-commerce. So the e-commerce sales are in both the numerator and the denominator. And so as e-commerce gets bigger, it you would expect it to slow down. So then in the pandemic, we saw these spikes, and then we kind of saw it regress to the pre-pandemic mean. And for 2024, we now have the complete data set. E-commerce only grew at 7.8%, which is way lower than that 15% pre-pandemic level. So kind of two hypotheses. One is, there was this McKinsey spike, and then, that pulled a bunch of demand forward, and then we gave all that demand back. And so we're still in the kind of recovery phase as a result of that spike. That's one theory. I don't think that theory is true. The other theory is that, the historic slowing of e-commerce is continuing as e-commerce becomes a bigger number. And that this kind of 8% growth is the new normal. Like, I would still point out, it's still 2 to 3 times faster growth than all of retail. It's still more than 4 times as fast as growth as brick and mortar. And if we take the e-commerce sales last year, which I'm not the biggest fan of this number, it's the most imperfect number in the U.S. Department of Commerce data, and I would argue it's kind of meaningless. But if we took the actual sales that happened in e-commerce and we divide those by core retail, so that's all retail sales minus restaurants, gas stations, and auto dealerships, which we could talk about why people do that. But if you look at e-commerce over core retail, e-commerce is now 22.5% of retail. So it's more than 1 out of every $5 spent is spent online. And so it stands to reason that that big a number is much harder to grow than 10 years ago when e-commerce was less than 10% of retail sales.
But I guess the other thing, and it gets back a little bit to what you're saying about averages, is if you see so much of this growth going to a few players, whether it's online or, obviously Amazon is almost all online, Walmart, Costco, little bit different story. It's got really different implications, I think, for anybody that happens not to be those players, right? Because they're not getting anywhere near the incremental growth and maybe getting a very different sort of outcome in terms of digital versus brick and mortar, and how much of digital is influencing physical stores and how much of physical stores is, you know what I mean? It's just like there's this blurring of the lines that goes on that we have to unpack from the numbers, as well as just people sit in really different positions competitively.
In general, like there's a bunch of different frameworks that all kind of have the same shape to them, but there's this like interesting phenomenon that instead of all retailers being on this spectrum, from, fastest growing to slowest growing, and it kind of be evenly distributed across that spectrum. That in general, you tend to that spectrum has two giant buckets in it, right? Like retailers that are doing really well and retailers that are doing pretty poorly. And there tend not to be a huge concentration of retailers in the middle, right? And several years ago, I was informed that phenomenon is called bifurcation.
Interesting. I'll have to look that up.
Yeah, so I don't remember who coined that phrase, but I certainly know some people that claim to have. So one clear bifurcation is the digital haves and have-nots, right? Like all growth in retail right now is digital. Walmart is impressive at Walmart size to still be, way outgrowing the whole retail industry. Digital represents a huge disproportionate share of their growth. I think their digital growth is still in the 20%. And of course, Amazon's 11% is essentially its digital growth. So you have like these digital haves and have-nots, which is a huge thing. I think there's a more interesting version of this bifurcation. There are retailers that are super good at selling everything, that are trying to be everything stores. And obviously that was kind of Amazon's stated mission, but I would certainly put Walmart in that category as well. I mean, Walmart now sells 80 million items online. Amazon probably sells 800 million items online. Walmart sells 120,000 items in a superstore. So these everything stores tend to be doing really well. And then there are stores that carry a very curated assortment, either because they're in a specialty category, so they only carry home improvement products, or they only carry consumer electronics, or because they tend to carry products that they make themselves, so they're a vertically integrated retailer, or someone with some really strong own brands. And you actually can see either end of that spectrum doing pretty well. There are curated retailers that are doing very well, selling their own stuff, and there's everything stores that are doing very well, selling everything. But the place you don't want to be is in between those two extremes. The wholesalers that mainly try to sell a medium assortment of other people's stuff, which is a perfect definition for department stores at the moment, like overall is not doing well. Like whether you're a good executor, bad executor, whether you're luxury or discount, like all the versions of people that are trying to make a living selling 80,000 SKUs that they buy from one company, mark up and sell to another company is a model that's not doing very well. And so I actually have this long range hypothesis that kind of the traditional wholesale model, which is what all retail used to be, is kind of going away in favor of these newer models.
Steve, just part one of a two-part basket of insights from Jason. What did you have? What jumped out at you from the conversation?
Well, I think we got into a number of things we've been talking about for a while, and he really just illuminated it with some different perspectives and some different data, particularly around the kind of land of the giants phenomenon, like how concentrated growth is. I think really helping understand the elements of bifurcation. We'll get into that a little bit more in part two. And so just maybe to tease that a little bit, one of the things Jason says in part two is he's going to discuss, or he shares, what he thinks the most important change in commerce is. So you want to come back for that. But we also get into some of the things we started to talk about with bifurcation, the digital haves and have-nots, how they're everything stores, and then kind of more special, like I like to call special, not big store, but the challenges in the middle that we continue to see. We start to talk about what's the future of wholesale. I would say he's pretty dire about that. We get into his outlook for Amazon's physical grocery dreams and whether he thinks that will be important, as well as how it fits into the Amazon flywheel. And then we also talk about social commerce, retail media networks, and TikTok shops. So as much as we covered a good amount of ground in part one, we got even perhaps more interesting stuff to talk about part two.
Steve, that's an excellent teaser for next week's episode. I was struck by Jason's discussion around effectively the decaying business models of department stores, with Hudson's Bay going into protection, probably liquidation. Many voices here in Canada are both trying to dissect what went wrong and postulating solutions. where what is increasingly clear is that the foundational model that powered retailers like Hudson's Bay, HBC, Sears, and Eaton's before it simply struggle to be relevant today to most consumers. Anyway, there's lots more to come from part 2 of our conversation with Jason. Be sure to tune in to our next episode. Thanks for tuning in. New episodes of Season 10 are available each and every Tuesday, so be sure and tell all your friends in the retail industry all about us. And make sure and visit our newly refreshed YouTube channel for exclusive video and our new virtual store tours. If you liked our episode, please take a moment to give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts.
And I'm Steve Dennis, strategic advisor, keynote speaker, and best-selling author of 2 books, Leaders Leap, Transforming Your Company at the Speed of Disruption, and Remarkable Retail, How to Win and Keep Customers in the Age of Disruption. You can learn more about me, my consulting, and keynote speaking at stephenpdennis.com.
And I'm Michael LeBlanc, consumer retail growth consultant and advisor, keynote speaker, and media entrepreneur. You can learn more about me on LinkedIn. Safe travels, everyone.